Hi, everyone. My name is Kat Romano, and I'm the Programming and Human Rights Coordinator at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and I want to welcome you all to our event today. Before we start, I want to go over a bit of housekeeping. Everyone participating will be kept on mute during the event, and today's discussion will be followed by a Q&A, during which you can ask questions by writing them in the chat. If you think of questions during our discussion, please feel free to write them into the chat, and I'll be monitoring it throughout. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message me directly and I'll do my best to help you. Now I'd like to pass it over to Sarah Fogg, Head of Communications at the museum, who will give the introduction this afternoon.
Thank you, Kat. So as Kat mentioned, my name is Sarah Fogg, and I'm Head of Communications here at the Montreal Holocaust Museum. As we begin today's event, I would like to take a moment to recognize that our museum is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, a nation that is recognized as custodians of the land and waters around us. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, a diverse Indigenous population, as well as many other groups, reside here. This land recognition is a small expression of the museum's solidarity with Canada's Indigenous peoples and our support of the quest for justice, equality, and recognition. Today also marks Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It's a crucial moment to come together, honor Indigenous peoples, discover their rich cultures, and learn about their difficult history of persecution. As a Canadian museum dedicated to the history of the Holocaust and its human rights legacy, it is crucial that on this day we help shed light on the long history of discrimination and the ongoing injustices against Indigenous peoples in this country. Today, we'll be delving into the painful history of residential schools and their intergenerational impacts through the award-winning film Sugarcane. We are honored to be joined by its brilliant filmmakers, Julian NoiseCat and Emily Kassie. Today's discussion will be expertly moderated by Deborah Corber, founder of Corber Consulting, a practice dedicated to advancing reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians. Today's event is also organized in collaboration with our friends at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre and the Indigenous Health Centre of Tiohtià:ke. Without further ado, over to you, Deborah, Julian, and Emily.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Kat. First, let me just say that I am really delighted and honored to have been asked to participate in this program and on such an important day in our national calendar, and to have been asked by the Montreal Holocaust Museum, which is really a jewel in the Montreal Jewish community, in fact, in the Jewish community in Canada. It has done and continues to do crucial work in teaching people not only about the Holocaust, but about human rights violations and genocides all over the world. I don't want to take too much time talking today because we have two guests with us who really need to have the microphone. But let me just start by a couple of observations. For me, there's really nothing like the power of storytelling to enlighten us and to move us. And there's nothing quite like the power of hearing people's direct testimony. I had an opportunity about 24 years ago while doing some work for the Canadian government to hear directly from survivors across the country. Many, many things were told and shared, including about children going missing. So the discovery of unmarked graves in 2021, while it was shocking, for me at any rate, it wasn't entirely surprising. This film, which I have now viewed, Sugarcane, twice, is for me a powerful and poignant film, but it's also a very layered film. It's a deeply personal story at the center of the film, involving Julian NoiseCat, who's with us today, involving him, his father, his grandmother, and others within their family and communal circle. But it also involves other very personal stories of survival, all told as physical, emotional, and spiritual journeys. And at the same time, running through these various personal stories are themes of faith, justice, acknowledgement, apology, accountability, and ultimately resilience. I would like to talk first and turn it over to our speakers about the inception of this film. At the center, as I said, is the journey of filmmaker Julian Brave NoiseCat to uncover the truth around his father's birth. Ed Archie NoiseCat was born at St. Joseph's Mission Residential School in Williams Lake, BC. That fact alone should set off alarm bells from early on in the film, because you need to ask yourself, why on earth is anyone being born in a residential school? So Julian, if you could, can you tell us about your motivation for undertaking this journey and for sharing it with the world?
Choklinov Kukchem, Deborah, good morning, or as it literally means, you all survived the night. Happy, happy is a weird way to say this, but I guess Truth and Reconciliation Day. Just want to acknowledge that that's what it is. Thank you so much to the Holocaust Museum in Montreal. I would try to say it in French, but I can't speak any French. For having us, really meaningful conversation for Em and I. You know, Em is fully Jewish. I have some Jewish ancestry myself on my mother's side. So it is, yeah, we're really grateful to be here to talk about our film, and there's still so much interest in it. You know, now almost 2 years since we put it out into the world. You know, just to answer the question, it's an interesting question, because very often I think people assume when they watch Sugarcane or they, you know, hear about the film that I like set out to make this film on my own, or that this was something that I would have done, you know, that I would have been driven to do that. But, you know, I think I'll just say two things. Firstly, that my background is not as a filmmaker, although now I am a filmmaker. I'm a writer and journalist, and I used to do some politics and activism type stuff. You know, I don't think that I would have set out to make a film of any kind, and definitely would not have set out to make a film on this topic if it weren't for my, you know, friend and long ago colleague, Emily Kassie, who, you know, for her own reasons that I'll let her narrate, felt really pulled to this story, and then drawn to collaboration with me. So I'll pass it to Em to sort of actually begin the story, because the project itself, the inception of the project, began with her.
Thanks, Jules. Just also want to say it's really good to be here. My parents are born and raised in the Montreal Jewish community, as were my grandparents. Although I was born in Toronto, I spent my childhood going to Montreal to see my grandparents, and so it's a real honor to be with you today. You know, like many young Jewish people, I was brought up in a community of survivors and their descendants. And so I had these questions about, you know, how we survive these types of traumas, how we pass along, you know, these stories, and sometimes the silences that permeate our families as well. And so I began a career as an investigative journalist and filmmaker, focusing on stories of persecution, because of, you know, my own background. And when the news of unmarked graves broke in May of 2021, I was blown away. You know, we had never really been taught, not really, we've never been taught about the residential schools in school in Canada. And I didn't even hear about them until I was a journalist, when a friend was working on a project surrounding them. And even then, I didn't know too much. And so when I learned about this, I was shocked, and I felt really drawn to the story, and felt like just so clear that this was what I had to do, and what I had to pursue. And the other thought that came immediately to me after that was to reach out to my old friend Julian. And Jules and we had worked our first reporting jobs together. We were randomly assigned the desks next to each other, as fate would have it. And Julian had gone on to have an incredible career as a writer and journalist, focusing mostly on Indigenous issues, and had become, you know, such an expert on it. So I reached out to him next, and said, would you be open to working on a project with me? Julian said he needed some time to think about it. And in the meantime, I went looking for a nation that said they were going to do a search. I found this article in the Williams Lake Tribune about Chief Willie Sellers in the Williams Lake First Nation in a school called St. Joseph's Mission. And I reached out to Chief Sellers that day. He called me back right away and said, the creator has always had great timing. Just yesterday, our council said we need someone to document our search, which is a really rare thing in an Indigenous community that they would allow someone to come in on such a sensitive issue, and especially someone who was not from that community. But Chief Willie had a different sort of vision for this. And so I had booked flights to go to Williams Lake. I had spoken with council. I was ready to go. And then I got a call from Julian. And when he called me, he said, hey, I've given it a lot of thought and I'm open to working on something with you. And I said, that's great. I forged ahead and I'm gonna be following this search at St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake. And Julian went silent. And then he said, that's really crazy. That's the school my family attended, and where I had heard a rumor my father was found in a dumpster, born and found in a dumpster nearby. Um, and that's all he had ever known. And I mean, I was blown away in that moment as well, that this had come together in such a faded way. And from there, Julian and I went to Williams Lake and spent the next 3 years making sugarcane. And I will mention that at the beginning, even though Julian had this incredible connection to the story, we actually didn't set out to tell his story from the beginning. And I'll let him talk about why.
I believe the Yiddish word is kismet. I might be incorrect on the Yiddish there. But yeah, I think
Sure, the shirt.
The
Bashert.
shirt.
Okay,
The
Bashert.
shirt.
Yeah, I think I think that this was just not I know there's not much I can do to belabor this point, but if your family has been sent to a residential school where they don't even talk about what happened at that school in society more broadly, let alone within your own family, as a survival strategy, that's maybe not exactly the kind of story that you're going to be eager to tell as a journalist. At least I was not. And at the same time, I think that there was a natural desire to know the story of my father's birth, on his part. I was always also kind of curious about it. But my grandmother is still alive. And, I obviously feel a lot of loyalty and love for her. She's the matriarch of our family. She's the reason I know how to speak Secwepemctsín, our language. And, as soon as M told me that she had identified, First Nation that was leading a search, that search was happening at that very school, one out of 139 across Canada that my family was sent to, that laid before me a set of not just creative and filmmaking decisions, but like huge life decisions that, were and continue to be very challenging to navigate. But that, luckily, we have been able to navigate in a way that has gotten some measure of truth for my father and some measure of reconciliation within our own family, which has been such a relief, honestly.
That was actually going to be one of my questions at the end, because it felt like that in watching the film towards the end, that there had been real movement in your relationship with your dad, and that there felt to me to be a kind of healing that was underway. But of course, that's my viewing of it. It's really great to hear you say that it had that impact. But just as an aside for a minute, you said that your grandmother taught you your native language. Can you say the name again of that language?
Sure. Secwepemctsín, it just means the language, the tongue, literally, of the spread out people is actually how you would literally translate all that. So Secwepemc is so Huep means spread out, Much means people, and then Chin means mouth. And then the S is often used in Salish languages, the N sometimes as well as a nominalizer. So Secwepemctsín, the language of the spread out people, the language of the Shuswap people.
So it's quite remarkable that your grandmother, as a survivor of residential schools, is
She's one of
still
only
able to.
two remaining fluent speakers on the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve. It's now only her and her sister, Elsie. And, within our nation, there's not really a good census of this. They haven't tried to count the number of fluent speakers that we have for over a decade now. I would guess that it's well under 100. I would put it less than 50. But there are efforts in other parts of our nation to revitalize the language. And I have a couple of cousins who are also, have taken on as their life work, their career to be language teachers. So, it's a big, I mean, we can get into this a little bit later, but part of the imperative that the residential schools and the broader history of colonization and assimilation have created for Indigenous peoples is to try to, hold on to and bring back, our ways, our traditions that were nearly wiped out by those schools, and that are not simply aesthetic things that differentiate us from the rest of society, but that are actually there's an entire way of life, a way of being, a way of looking at the world, a way of telling stories, of making art, of relating to one another and to our land, et cetera, that are contained in
the language,
that culture, and that was exactly what was targeted by the residential schools as part of the process of trying to, as that was said by one of the architects of the residential school system, to get rid of the Indian problem.
And another phrase that was used was to kill the Indian in the child.
To kill the Indian and save the man was the phrase in the U.S. system. Yes, that's George Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School.
Anyway, I was struck by the comment about your grandmother being a speaker, because of course that is a victory over residential schools, that she at least still has her language. Anyway,
we really wanted to. I mean, in the film, if you watch the film, that's one of the main ways in which my cat and I, you see us interacting, because that's the truth of our relationship. I'm constantly asking her stuff about the language and words and all that sort of stuff, and struggling to pronounce different things or get things right. There's actually a funny part where I add an accidental. I make a plural out of something in the film that is actually not supposed to be a plural, which is kind of funny to me. Anyways, the point being that this is the effort to bring back our languages and our culture in the wake of this thing, is a huge part of what's going on across Indian country. And also, I think it's supposed to be in there to encourage, especially Native viewers to try. I mean, part of what's so intimidating about a language like Secwepemctsín and many other Indigenous languages is that the phonology is also very challenging. Like these languages are way different from English. Like to learn how to pronounce these different things is a challenge, and also means that people need to be like willing to. This is kind of a maybe banal point, but you need to be willing to like make mistakes and stuff. And so, the point of putting the language in the film was really like a sort of, and the learning of the language in the film was really sort of a refutation of the mission of the schools. And the film itself entirely is a refutation of the mission of the schools, because it insists that the way of life, that our culture, is a good and beautiful thing and deserves to live, which was, precisely the opposite of what the residential schools said.
Yes, quite so. Okay, well, I want to get you both talking more, so I'd like to throw out a few observations that I made on the film the second time I watched it, things that really had, as I told Emily before, gone completely over my head the first time when I didn't know, of course, how the narrative was going to unfold. I'll throw these out there and then let the two of you talk about them. One is the role of silence in the film, both sort of in the film, in the pacing of the film, and as a legacy of intergenerational trauma, which is something that Holocaust survivors, the Holocaust survivor community and their families are obviously intimately familiar with. What does it do to a person not to be heard, not to be believed? And I took down some quotes last night that struck me. One was a woman who says, I was abused. I told my grandmother and she didn't want to hear about it. I told the nuns and they told me to tell the priest. And he told me to tell the Indian agent, who, for those who don't know, would have been the bureaucratic civil servant allocated to a particular area of the country. He told me to tell the RCMP. The RCMP told my father, who then beat the shit out of me. So I went out and bought a bottle of wine and got drunk. So the theme of not being believed. The visual role of fire, which, as I said to Emily before, you see first as a campfire at the beginning. And if you don't know that the progression of the story, you may not realize that it is foreshadowing the horror of babies being incinerated. And complex feelings around faith. One quote that stayed in my mind was somebody said, you have to go to confession once a week when you're in residential schools, and you have to confess to the same priest who's dragging you out of bed at night. The role of fear that the Catholic Church inculcated in the children. Another quote, the ones who said this was a sin, they're the ones who actually did all the action. And then the attachment to Christianity despite everything. One person in the film says, our elders held religion so close, I thought there must be something good in there. And lastly, the disappointment, the disillusionment, I'm not sure, of the late Chief Rick Gilbert when he travels once again on the theme of a journey to Rome for an audience with the Pope, meets with a high-ranking oblate priest who listens sympathetically. And when Chief Gilbert points out that the priests who were identified as having abused children were simply removed from one school and then placed in another school to repeat the abuse all over again. And the oblate listens, very sympathetically, and then ultimately essentially says, well, those were the societal attitudes back then. We're better now, more politely than that. So over to you guys. Talk about any of those themes or anything else that you want to share with us.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for those thoughtful questions. Jules, okay if I take faith and you take silence?
Whatever. But you can talk about whatever you want. I'll just follow on whatever you say.
Okay. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about faith, which was a huge theme for us in this film. As you mentioned, Chief Rick Gilbert very much holds on to his faith despite the fact that he is the son of a priest who raped his mother. And four generations of his family were abused, sexually abused at the school, and yet, when he passed, he had two ceremonies, one on the res and one in the Catholic Church that held off until the bishop could come because it was that important to him. I think what we wanted to say with faith in this film is that it's complicated. On the one hand, the the communities that we're focusing on are very spiritual people and had a full, sense of spirituality and all of these things before the missionaries came. And when that happened and it was pushed on them, it also became, especially in the schools, one of the only things to hold on to when everyone around you, if you're not allowed to connect to your family, your language, your culture, and you're in fear, but there's this nice man named Jesus who loves you, it's not hard to understand why that would become a part of your faith and a part of feeling safe and connected to something. And there are so many people in these communities, including Julian's, who still hold the Catholic faith very close, and have even integrated it into, there are prayers in Secwepemcgene that, Julian knows, and people still attend church and all of these things. And we wanted to look at how the institution of the Catholic Church and other church institutions who ran these schools carried out like unspeakable, unfathomable harms. And we're also, we didn't get into this in the film, but we're also running like money laundering schemes and getting rich off of this system from all of the taxpayer dollars, as well as, being moved around to abuse children at all of these different schools. And very few ever came to justice. And the Catholic Church, the most that has happened was the Pope's apology. And we can kind of see how this comes together when Rick goes to the Vatican, not only for this, apology that's going to happen, but also because this is the place that half of his lineage is connected to, his father, his biological father, the priest. And as a Catholic, I think Rick went looking there for something that would tell him more about who he was, and thought maybe he would get some answers. And what he found there was a lot of emptiness. And it was interesting being in the room when the Pope made it his apology, because you had all of these people, all these Indigenous people from across Canada who had come for this and had been preparing for this day. And I had snuck onto the bus and snuck in actually to the Vatican, even though I was not welcome, to film this scene. And I remember in the room just like the excitement and that finally something would happen. And then, the Pope gave his speech entirely in Italian, which nobody understood. And so everyone was like, didn't know exactly what was happening. And then he finished and he said bye-bye and he left. And there was this kind of like letdown of what was that? And like, was that enough? Is that what we've been looking for? And I remember on the bus on the way back, there was a woman who said, "So did he apologize?" And someone else, one of the Catholic bishops on the bus said, "Yes, here's what he said." She began to cry because it meant something to her. And I think there are people who it meant something to, but it wasn't enough. It was not nearly enough. And the Catholic Church still has not opened their records to Indigenous communities. They've not
Right.
paid their part. And as the priest said to Rick, and I think that this really encapsulates the whole attitude of the Catholic Church, is that when Rick says, like, I need you to do something, he says, in God alone, and I think um, there's a lot to be said for that about what this institution is, and the havoc and pain that it's wreaked on so many communities all over the world. Um, and at the same time, I think it's understandable why people hold on to their faith and practice it in the way that makes sense to them. And so we wanted to present that very complicated duality, with as much nuance as possible.
Yeah, I'll just follow on to the piece about silence and just make one quick comment about the spirituality thing. I think that overall it's a film that's, skeptical and pessimistic about religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, but also the government, the law enforcement agencies. There were so many institutions that were involved in the institution of the Indian residential schools. It wasn't just the schools. And yet I think it's also a film that is optimistic about the spirit and very open to the reality that spirituality is a central part of human life, in complicated ways, right? In both a colonized Catholic kind of sense and also in a Indigenous context, and also in a conversation existing between those two things. As Em says, there are hymns in Sugat Lachchin that are part of our religious practice. And I think that is just worth pointing out, that is saying something to the broader field of nonfiction, that it tends to be a very secular kind of storytelling. Journalism comes from very secular roots that reaches for forms of investigative, historical, social scientific fact. And I think that that is to deny a huge part of human experience and existence, particularly in a story like this one that has to do with questions of life, death, tradition, and what it is to carry forward the imperiled ways of your ancestors. I think those are all deeply spiritual questions at the end of the day that secular answers, will fall short in responding to. On the silence piece, I'll try to be brief with this, but essentially, a big subject of conversation for all Native history is is why it is so invisible, why it is so erased. It's a big sociological question. It's a constant subject of study in, Indigenous academia. I think what we are adding to that discussion is that, not only is there silence in the broader, Canadian and Catholic sort of world about this, but there's also an internalized silence within, Indigenous communities ourselves, that is actually part of the survival strategy. That is how, people like Mike, survived institutions like St. Joseph's Mission. That is how people like the late Chief Rick Gilbert persisted despite, his immense trauma that he carried in his literal DNA, from this institution, was by not giving voice to the truth, and that silence, then carried across generations with lots of impacts. I think that silence also made it really important that we made this film when we did, because the reality is that the survivors of these institutions are now all in their 60s, 70s, 80s. You quoted someone, two people actually who are now not with us anymore, the late Chief Rick Gilbert, as well as Rosalind Sam, whose funeral I attended during while we were making the film. Incredible spirit, by the way, just as like one of the most powerful things I've ever heard anyone say was the line that you quoted about her having, told all these different figures about her rape and then what that did to her when they did nothing. And then I think it's, worth pointing out that the film itself also suggests that there is a broader silence in this history that will persist despite the efforts to know the truth. Firstly, I think it's worth pointing out that the survivors that we all hear from, nowadays, these are all children who are taken to the schools, and there are entire generations worth of this experience of the parents of the children who are taken away, who also carried immense trauma and pain from the experience of, for example, the one piece of this history that haunts me always is when people talk about how quiet the res went after the kids were taken away. And, there was an entire experience of this that was what it was for, an entire race of people to be denied the right to parent their children. And from, most of the stuff that we hear about these days is from the perspective of the kids. And I think it's important to point out that there were older people in Native communities too, who had to grapple with this history. The last thing that I would say is that, this is the first film to break new investigative ground on a pattern of infanticide at one institution. This is just one out of 139 schools across Canada and 417 across the United States. It is not the only institution where there are stories in communities surrounding residential schools about patterns of infanticide, about babies being adopted out, aborted, and put into trash incinerators. This is not the only school where this kind of thing has been discussed in, the surrounding community of survivors. So I think that it's worth, pointing out that there is enormous amounts of truth that we still do not know about what happened at these institutions, and that history is not just Indigenous history, that is, all of Canadians' history, that is all of North America's history. This is a foundational story to how the land was taken, what happened to First Peoples, to our children, to our families. And it has enduring impacts, creates a lot of harm and pain to this day in our lives.
I often think that there's a reason that truth comes before reconciliation. We talk a lot about reconciliation. It's a big buzzword today. And, in many respects, I'm a true believer. On the other hand, I recognize that there is no reconciliation without truth before it. And when all investigation is shut down, and when all who can testify to something, who can tell the truth of what happened, are silenced, and when records won't be turned over, and when you just make it difficult, if not impossible, to know the truth, you can't really ever, I think, hope to progress to any form of reconciliation. And the other thing maybe you can talk a little bit about is significance of apology. Emily, you pointed out that there was a delegation, including Chief Gilbert, who went to Rome. They were looking for an apology. I don't know exactly what they got. That trite, almost flippant little bye-bye at the end just really felt like cold water to me, just as a viewer from the Pope. Bye-bye. Um, but whatever people felt about whether it was an apology or not, it seems to me that apology is not accountability, right? So when we talk about what the Catholic Church has or hasn't done, it hasn't really taken accountability. It was the last of all of the churches to have to be pressured and still hasn't really stepped up. There were other denominations that were running some of the residential schools, although the Catholics were dominant, and they have provided compensation. Catholic Church, not so much. So, how do you think about apology and the value of apology, particularly when it does not come with accountability?
Joel, you can start.
Oh, I think M narrated the story of the apology, in some of her answer. I think that, um, I think that the response to it, varies based upon your relationship to the Catholic Church, which tends to correlate with your generation. I think it's worth pointing out that the apology was worded not just what you said about the bye-bye and the tone of it all. It was delivered in Italian to a room full of non-Italian speakers.
Mm.
And which it begs a question to me of like, if you want people to feel like you mean your apology to them, why would you deliver it in a language that they can't understand? And secondly, I think that the way that the Catholic Church has tried to elide responsibility for this has been to say that this is essentially the all of these wrongdoings somehow, the thousands of the thousands of unaccounted for children that were sent to these schools, the pattern of infanticide at St. Joseph's Mission, the rampant sexual abuse, the moving of priests who were abusers to other schools, that this somehow was just a massive uh, meeting of many bad actors, and that there was no which defies any like they must think that we're stupid. I guess they must think that like we're dumb. Like they're saying that all these patterns exist, but there was no systemic, there was no combined effort of people to do this, to cover it up. There's no institutional accountability. Because institutional accountability would require them to do what they've done across other parts of the Catholic world, which is to, pay up and to do the right thing by the way, people who remain faithful Catholics. Rick Gilbert had to delayed his own funeral for multiple weeks so that he could have the Archbishop of British Columbia attend the services. Like I go to mass with my cat. I could sing Ode to Celtic Tamil in my language right now. Like we're not talking about people who hate the church that we're asking to be accountable to. We're asking to be accountable to people who still go to church on Sundays. At the same time, I think that there's a reasonable question in any Indigenous context as to whose justice, in what system do we think that the church needs to be held accountable. And by that, I want to be very clear. I mean, that there are non-colonial, pre-existing Indigenous forms of law, of governance, of justice that, exist on this land that involve ceremony, involve systems of reciprocity, involve, meaningfully taking accountability for one's actions, and then, creating the possibility for recompense and healing. That do not require you to go to, a British Columbia court or a federal court, that would not, necessarily manifest themselves in the form of a settlement, or a lawsuit. I think you've worked with my auntie Charlene Bellew before, and she has, made some of these kinds of forms of justice possible when the colonial justice system has fallen short. And I think it's totally reasonable to ask in the wake of a system that was a massive colonial conspiracy wherein justice has never been really served. What it might be to seek justice through, Indigenous means. And I think people get all freaked out when you say stuff like that because it kind of calls the whole project into question, the whole colonial project into question. But, I think that's what I'm particularly interested in, particularly if we're talking about the kind of reconciliation that I think you do see in the film, which is not necessarily reconciliation between Indigenous peoples in the church or Indigenous peoples and the government, but, Indigenous peoples within our own communities and within our families, which, I really believe is essential for us to move forward.
I'll just add one quick little thing that's in the film that I think was a really salient moment for us. And the reason we put it in is that after Rick has this confrontation with the oblate priest, we show him walking through the Vatican Museum. And in the Vatican Museum, you see the riches of the Vatican and all of the wealth. And he's moving through the space, and the exhibit happens to kind of spit you out into this hall of stolen artifacts, and particularly Indigenous artifacts. And so he's staring, looking at what was taken from his own people in this house of riches. You have the Sistine Chapel. You have, it's and we shot the whole thing sort of out of focus. What he's looking at sort of out of focus and in this sort of dreamlike state because of how surreal it is to see the power and the wealth and how threatened they were by the existence of culture and language and of people who did things differently than they did, and to extract that and then to give nothing in return in the aftermath it's extraordinary.
I'm really glad you explained that the dream, I was a little bit puzzled by that, but now it makes perfect sense. I think that whole experience for him looked from the outside looking in like the definition of cognitive dissonance, really. Of Yeah, I felt he's very quiet through that whole sequence, and you just have to read into it that there's dissonance and there's disappointment and pain. I know we don't have a lot more time, and I've already seen a question in the chat, but I did want to ask a couple of other things. One, Julian, if you don't mind, would you tell us about the story behind your name?
It's a complicated question. So my last name is NoiseCat, right? And we capitalize the N and the C in case you ever need to write it down. NoiseCat is actually essentially missionaries' bastardization of an ancestral name, NoiseCat, which was my great-grandmother Alice's last name. Her name was Alice NoiseCat. She was from Canoe Creek, specifically a little place called Copper Johnny Meadow. And when my dad got married to my mom, he decided to change his name legally from Archie to NoiseCat, his last name, because after he was found at the, mission in the trash incinerator, he was raised by his grandmother, his Alice, for the first number of years of his life until she tragically froze to death in a blizzard, going out to go try to find her husband, my great grandfather, who'd gone out drinking in a blizzard, and she got stuck in the snow and died. So that was another thing that my dad lived through. You don't even learn about that in the film. And so the thing that was really intense about all this is, in addition to what I just told you, is that my father's cries for life when he was in the trash incinerator minutes after being born and, probably moments from death, potentially, according to the article in the Williams Lake Tribune and according to the observations of the man who found him, the night watchman at the mission, a guy named Tony Stoop, Dutch guy, sounded like the cries of a cat, which is a truly wild coincidence because, of course, NoiseCat has nothing to do with noises and cats in, the traditional Secwet Mochchin interpretation. But that was a meaning and a story, I guess, that came to the name, later, and that we learned through the making of Sugarcane and through the writing of my book, We Survived the Night. And so, yeah, there's something about Indians and names, and something about, the way that stories find people and words in there. And if you want to learn more about that, I'll just say I have a book coming out on October 14th. It's called We Survived the Night, An Indigenous Reckoning. It'll be published by Penguin Random House Canada. And there's actually an excerpt out right now, if you wanted to go read it, on the Paris Review's website called Indian Names, that tells the story of my dad's name that I just narrated.
I'm just going to add one thing. First, that article Julian spoke about, it literally says the noise of a cat. He thought it sounded like the noise of a cat. And when
Yes.
we heard that, we were like, I mean, it was just like, yeah. But I also wanted to mention, Jules, correct me if I'm wrong, but was it not your Jewish grandmother who chose the name Brave?
Yeah, she was Irish and Jewish. Yeah, my grandmother had a sense of humor, I guess. She thought she was going to have a little Indian Brave for her grandson, so she chose Brave for my for my middle name.
But I kind of love that
But
because, it's like it's another story of like, she also kind of predicted a sort of courage that you would have in your life. And, that came from this other, history of your family. And so I just wanted to mention that because I think it's also a pretty moving story about how a name someone can live up to their name.
and I thought of the brave as how brave it is to have embarked on this journey, and to have been, even if it didn't start out as being your primary motivation for doing the film, but doing it and sharing it with us seems to me to be something incredibly brave to do. Okay, I'm looking for you, Kat. I'm seeing some things in the chat here. I did want to ask you, though, before we get to some of the questions, I wanted to ask you how communities have reacted to the film. And that question to both of you in whichever order.
Yeah, I think for both Jules and I, the most important audience was going to be the one in Sugarcane, and in Williams Lake. And we were really, really nervous, because no one had seen anything. So before Sundance, we kind of did an illegal pre-Sundance screening and showed the film to Chief and Council, and the participants. And we were blown away. People were profoundly moved. And when we eventually brought it back to Williams Lake and did 7 back-to-back screenings over a weekend, where like 800 survivors and their descendants came to see the films, people saw themselves in it. And we found that across Indigenous communities, people would come up to us and say, I drove here 5 hours with my dad because he saw an article about it and we said we have to go. And on the way drive home, he shared what he had gone through for the first time in his life. And we heard that a version of that sentiment, or I feel like I can finally forgive my parents after seeing this film, like everywhere. And I will just say beyond Indigenous communities too, there were so many Catholics who came to the film and were so profoundly moved by it. Additionally, folks who had suffered abuse at the hands of priests who were non-Indigenous, and then
Mhm.
lots of people who just related to the story in their own lives. The father-son narrative and that struggle to forgive and move on with a parent, or the secrets we kind of keep within our families. There were just so many ways that people connected to the film. And I think one of the most meaningful screenings outside of Indigenous communities was when we showed the film to a bunch of folks who are working on reconciliation and truth commissions all over the world, from Northern Ireland to Rwanda to South Africa, and all of them all over the world saw themselves in this film and some connection to their people in this film. And we've also been really lucky to bring the film on something called a what we called a res tour, where we've brought it to reserves and reservations across North America, but also to the Maori in New Zealand. Actually, Jules and I are meeting in a few days in Norway to meet the Sami people who are screening the film. So that has been an incredible experience.
I would just say that we've had incredible response to the film, and I think that part of what's been so beautiful about it is that people um, have come to an understanding of this history of the cultural genocide that happened to First Peoples, of Canadian history, North American history more broadly. They've also seen, I think, the universal themes within it. Fatherhood, parenting, relationships within families, intergenerational trauma, family secrets. It's also a road trip film, questions of spirituality and tradition. These are all things that I think people beyond just Native people grapple with. At the same time, I would say that, I was always hoping that there would be a little bit more of a conversation about this film within the Catholic world, and, the broader sort of Christian world, because I think that there is obviously accountability on that front. And, we've been making and are making efforts in that front, and there haven't been no conversations. But, it is notable to me that on the one hand, like, we got our absolute best reviews, from Ireland, for example. We got 2 5-star reviews from the Irish Times and another paper out there. And there's, so much resonance of this film with the history of, like, the Magdalene laundries, for example. And at the same time, there have not been nearly as many Catholic communities and faith communities that have, invited us in to talk about this, particularly, like, from the Christian faith, as there have been Indigenous ones.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to, I think now, I don't want to say open the floor for questions, because I have a list of questions here already that I'm going to pose to you. But just in case I lose the opportunity and we get closed out before I get to say this, I'm very grateful personally for both of you having made this film and having come to talk with us about it today. And for all of those who are listening, I cannot recommend it enough. It is magnificent and chilling and heartwarming and inspiring and all kinds of other things as well. But it's powerful, and I think it's must see viewing. So I hope you will take the time. I believe that it's the link was provided and people have a window within which they can watch it, and they still have some time, I think.
It's also on Disney Plus, so please encourage your friends, family, and everyone to watch it there.
So for those people who, when they canceled their Disney Plus recently, but then got it back again after all of the shenanigans south of the border, okay, if you have Disney Plus, you can watch it there. Okay, some questions. Are there any other films or educational projects like Wapakoni Mobile or others that you find have improved awareness about the history of Indigenous peoples and about residential schools?
I would say there's definitely many. Well, maybe not many, but there's definitely a few. One that is really powerful, based on the novel by Richard Wagamese, is the film Indian Horse. The novel is also definitely worth reading. One that I watched when I was a kid that is not specifically about the Indian residential schools per se, but that was my way of understanding this history, is a film from Australia called Rabbit Proof Fence. Really, really powerful film. And, I would also say that Connie Walker's journalism, her podcast Stolen, which I think is the first podcast or first audio journalism work to have been, to win both a Pulitzer and it was a Peabody, maybe it was the combination, is incredible. And, the way in which she also takes on telling a personal story about her family, and also father connection to the residential schools, was beautiful, and was also, I would say, a slight intellectual inspiration for Sugarcane.
Thank you. Denial is a shared challenge faced by Jewish and Indigenous communities today. Did you encounter any denial or pushback after making the film?
Yeah, I'll take this, and I'm also going to address the question in the chat about the unmarked graves not being verified. To the first question about denial, yes, there's a denialist movement, a Catholic denialist movement who have come for the film over and over again throughout our release of it. And I think, whenever mass atrocity is perpetuated, it comes with denialism. We've seen that all over the world. We saw it with the Holocaust. We continue to see it with that. I think that it's a very painful thing for people to accept something that their faith or community or institution carried out. I think we can tell you as journalists who spent years with these records and with these communities that there's just when people have lived this experience, you can feel it. You can look at the letters that detail abuse from priest to priest. You can take a DNA test like Rick did and know that he's the son of a priest. I mean, there are so many different pieces of evidence. And so our kind of strategy was just to keep going and to keep telling the story because that's what mattered and to let the denialists kind of do what they were going to do. I do think that there is a good question here about unmarked graves and the kind of concerns that that was, not real or not true. And I think there are a few things. One is that what we wanted to do with the film, first of all, it's absolutely true that without excavation, you cannot confirm what is under the ground for sure. So you have to excavate and test and find bones or fragments of remains in order to confirm 100% that it is a human body. That is true. And a lot of Indigenous communities have not moved to excavation for spiritual reasons community decisions around that. What we tried to make the film about and what I think it is about is what happened at these schools. And we know that kids died there. We have the birth certificates that say that they died without a cause and without a burial place. Like we know that there are kids who are unaccounted for by the actual birth certificates themselves. We know that there were babies put in the incinerator, not only because of eyewitness testimonies, because it was in the local paper where Julian's dad was found. There are so many ways, this is a history that is now, this last school closed in 97, but a lot of the atrocities that happened in, from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, it's hard to collect evidence at this point, like where the ashes from the incinerator were dumped in the river. But what happened at these schools and the real lived experiences of people and the way that um, it affected generations of family with who are now dealing with alcohol abuse and addiction and suicides as a direct result of the horrors that were perpetrated at these schools. It's not hard to understand how deep the pain is. That doesn't just happen. And I think that what we wanted to show was the emotional truth of what people went through, and also the fact that we have records describing different pieces of evidence from all of these things. And we know that there are kids in the ground. How many there are, we don't know, but they're there.
I would just I'd just like to add to that and just say that for those who think there's no evidence of what happened, in the early 1920s, as far back as the 20s, there was a fellow by the name of Dr. Peter Bryce, who was the chief health inspector for the Department of Indian Affairs at the time. And he was sending report after report to the government telling them that Indigenous children were dying in crazy numbers in residential schools for a whole variety of reasons. Eventually he was let go from his position and he self-published a report. And the government's response, just so people are all clear, then Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs Duncan Campbell Scott replied, and this is a quote, "It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in these schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of the department, which is being geared towards the final solution of our Indian problem," a phrase that you referenced at the beginning, Julian. So if people are interested in evidence, there's all kinds of evidence that exists. I'm being told I need to wrap up, but before I do, a more personal question to Julian, if I may. How are you? How's your dad? And how is your grandma?
My grandmother's doing well. She's got a whole bunch of descendants. She is still with us. She's still teaching the language, which is amazing. Her and her sister are in their car going down the road seemingly every day to go to a different place to teach language and to go to cultural gatherings or to see family. It's, they're like a little a sitcom. It's really lovely. She and my father are a lot closer, since the making of the film. He's taken time to go visit her, which is something that, I kind of pointedly take him on about in the early going of the film. My dad's doing well. He's up in Whistler today, actually talking about his art on Truth and Reconciliation Day. And he was there to talk about the film just the other day. So he's enjoying his time up there with his partner, their dog. And I'm doing well. I'm here in the Vancouver area right now, getting ready for my book tour, which kicks off in less than 2 weeks now. My book comes out 2 weeks from today on October 14th. Again, it's called We Survived the Night. You can pre-order it wherever you want to pre-order books. It's being published by Penguin Random House Canada. And, I think that on the most basic level, it's been really beautiful to make art, to tell the story, and to see Em and my film, received in such a beautiful way. And for, this far out from it coming out into the world, people still spending the time to engage with it, to watch it, to invite us to Q&As. It is a real honor and a blessing to get to do this work. And, I hope that we both get to continue doing it for as long as they'll let us, which, seems like any day now they might make this kind of thing illegal in the United States. So.
Well, we hope they will not only allow you to make this kind of fabulous work, but really empower you and support you in doing it, because you're two very important and promising voices for all of us. And for those of us on this Zoom who are older, like I am, it's really very inspiring and gratifying to see young people stepping up and telling the stories that absolutely must be heard. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah and just say thank you very much for allowing me to participate. And thank you so much to both of you, Julian and Emily. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you so much. I have to jump off, so I just want to say thank you to everybody. And yeah, this was very special. And thank you, Deborah, for doing such an excellent job. And I'll see you in Norway, Jules.
See you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, you three. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and asking your insightful questions. On behalf of the Montreal Holocaust Museum and our partners, the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center and the Indigenous Health Center of Tiohtià:ke, we are profoundly grateful to Julian, Emily, and Deborah for bringing the crucial story of sugarcane to us. If today marks the beginning of your education about Indigenous peoples in Canada, we invite you to learn more through organizations like the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, the Legacy of Hope Foundation, and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, all of whom offer numerous resources in both English and French. If you have not yet watched Sugarcane, please note that it's still available with us with the museum until October 6th. So we encourage you to share the film with your friends and your family. Thank you again.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.